The miso crock is cold against your palm when you press it in the morning, cold the way old clay is cold, holding the night's temperature longer than the air around it has held anything. And inside it, something is alive, genuinely alive, in the way that the word alive means when it is not being used loosely or metaphorically, but with full biological seriousness. Billions of organisms, Lactobacillus, Aspergillus, Oryzae. The slow, patient, 3-year conversation between salt and soybean, and time that the modern supplement industry has spent 40 years and several billion dollars attempting to put into a capsule and has not quite managed. Your grandmother did not press her palm against the miso crock every morning because she knew about lactobacillus. She pressed it the way you check on something you are responsible for, like in the way you put your hand on the forehead of a sleeping child, the way you tend what tends you back. This is the record of 25 things the Japanese kitchen understood about the body long before the body had a vocabulary to explain itself. They were not called metabolic interventions. They were not called probiotic protocols or lipase inhibitors or gut microbiome optimization strategies. They were called breakfast. They were called the right way to cook a radish. They were called what your mother did and her mother before her. And the chain of transmission was not a research paper but a hand on a wooden spoon. A voice saying, "Not yet," when the pot came to a boil too fast. A pair of eyes watching steam rise from a clay lid the way a navigator watches the horizon, reading information that the instrument panel does not carry. The 25 things that follow exist at the intersection of what the 1970s farmhouse kitchen knew intuitively and what the nutritional biochemistry of the last 30 years has been slowly, laboriously confirming. They are food tricks only in the sense that any deep knowledge looks like a trick to the person who does not yet possess it. To the person who does possess it, they are simply the way things are done. The way things have always been done. The way things will continue to be done in any kitchen that understands that the body is not a machine to be fueled, but an ecology to be tended. The first is the cold rice trick, and it is the most counterintuitive of all 25 because it requires you to do something to rice that every instinct about food tells you is a mistake. Let it go cold. Specifically, cook the rice, or allow it to cool completely, refrigerate it for at least 12 hours, and then eat it cold or reheat it gently, never aggressively. What happens to rice during this cooling process is a molecular transformation called retrogradation. The starch chains that cooking has opened and made rapidly digestible, rearranging themselves in the cold into a structure called resistant starch, which behaves in the digestive system not as a simple carbohydrate, but as a prebiotic fiber passing through the small intestine without being absorbed as glucose and arriving in the colon, where the bacteria of the gut microbiome ferment it into short-chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate, which is the primary fuel source of the cells lining the colon wall and which has been identified as a key regulator of the inflammatory signaling that underlies, among other conditions, the metabolic dysfunction that produces persistent fat storage. The 1970s Japanese kitchen did not refrigerate rice with this intention. It refrigerated rice because the rice was left over, and waste was not permissible. The chazuke made from cold rice poured with hot tea. The chahan made from day-old refrigerated grains that separated more cleanly in the pan than fresh rice ever does. The onigiri made the night before and eaten cold at the school desk the next morning. All of these were practices of economy that were simultaneously practices of metabolic intelligence, the two so thoroughly overlapping that separating them is artificial, a distinction made possible only by the fact that we now know the mechanism, and they did not need to. The second is the specific timing of miso soup, which the Japanese kitchen placed at the beginning of the meal rather than at the end, and which nutritional research has identified as a placement of unexpected sophistication. Consuming fermented foods before the main caloric intake of a meal primes the digestive system in several concrete ways. The organic acids of fermentation lower the pH of the stomach environment, improving the efficiency of protein digestion by activating pepsin at the optimal acidity. The live cultures of properly made miso stimulate the production of secretory IgA in the gut lining, the immunoglobulin that functions as the first line of defense against pathogenic organisms in the digestive tract, and the glutamates of long-fermented miso trigger the cephalic phase of digestion, the anticipatory release of digestive enzymes that begins before food has even arrived in the stomach, and that significantly improves the metabolic efficiency of everything that follows. Your grandmother placed the miso soup at the beginning because that was where it went. The body placed the miso soup at the beginning because the body is older and wiser than the menu. The third is the vinegar trick of the Sonomono. The small dressed salad of cucumber or wakame or octopus in rice vinegar that appeared as a side dish at the Japanese meal with a regularity that felt like preference and was also, it turns out, physiology. Acetic acid, the primary organic acid of rice vinegar, has a specific and well-documented effect on the enzyme that converts excess blood glucose into stored fat. I use the enzyme whose activity is the biochemical mechanism of the fat storage that the modern diet has made chronically, pathologically overactive. Acetic acid inhibits this enzyme. A tablespoon of rice vinegar consumed with or immediately before a carbohydrate-containing meal reduces the postprandial glucose spike by a measurable and clinically relevant amount, reduces the consequent insulin spike by a proportional amount, and reduces the amount of excess glucose that the liver converts into triglycerides and packages for storage in the adipose tissue. The Japanese kitchen did not design the Sonomono as a glucose management tool. It designed the Sonomono as something refreshing before rice, something that cleared the palate and prepared the appetite, and something that tasted of the sea and the mountains simultaneously in the way that vinegar and seaweed together always taste. The metabolic consequence was a benefit received without being sought, the kind of benefit that accrues to people who do the right thing for the right reasons and do not need the additional justification. The fourth trick is the one that takes the longest to explain because it requires understanding what the word fermented actually means when it is applied to the long-aged miso that the grandmother kept at the bottom of the crock rather than the commercially produced miso paste that sits in a plastic tub on the supermarket shelf and was fermented for 3 weeks under controlled industrial conditions. The difference is not one of degree, but of kind. 3-year fermented mugi miso contains a diversity of bacterial and fungal species that the 3-week industrial product cannot develop in the time available to it. Diversity of microbial species in a fermented food correlates directly with the diversity of microbial species it can introduce and support in the gut microbiome. And diversity of the gut microbiome is the single most consistent predictor of metabolic health that research has identified across populations. More predictive than BMI, more predictive than dietary fat intake, more predictive than almost any single variable that the metabolic health research of the last 20 years has examined. The old miso from the bottom of the crock was more powerful medicine than the new miso from the top. I'm sure the grandmother knew this the way she knew the miso was ready, by pressing her palm against the clay and feeling the difference. The fifth is the specific cooking method applied to burdock root, gobo, the vegetable that the Japanese kitchen has used continuously for over 1,000 years and that the Western kitchen has largely ignored in the way that the Western kitchen has largely ignored anything that requires more than 5 minutes of preparation and cannot be eaten raw. Burdock root is the most concentrated dietary source of inulin available to the Japanese table, and inulin is the prebiotic fiber that selectively feeds Bifidobacterium, the genus of gut bacteria most strongly associated with healthy weight regulation, reduced systemic inflammation, and the production of the neurotransmitter precursors that regulate appetite signaling from the gut to the brain. The trick is the water. Burdock is shaved or julienned and immediately submerged in cold water with a few drops of rice vinegar, where it sits for 10 minutes before cooking. This step, which the recipe transmits as preventing browning, simultaneously draws out a portion of the tannins and oxalic acid that would otherwise make the burdock harsh and astringent, producing a vegetable that is gentler on the gut lining and whose inulin is more bioavailable because it is not competing with the binding action of tannin compounds. The recipe says, soak the burdock to keep the color. The body understands, prepare the burdock so that I can use what it carries. The sixth is the kombu cold brew trick, the overnight extraction of dashi that extracts the full glutamate content of the kombu without heat, and which also, crucially, preserves the alginate compounds that heat degrades. Alginate is a soluble fiber specific to brown seaweeds that has been shown to inhibit pancreatic lipase, the digestive enzyme responsible for breaking down dietary fats into absorbable fatty acids in the small intestine. Inhibiting pancreatic lipase partially reduces the absorption of dietary fat, reducing the caloric load of a fat-containing meal without reducing the sense of satiety that dietary fat provides. This is, in the pharmacological language of obesity medicine, a fat absorption inhibitor, a mechanism that the pharmaceutical industry has spent considerable resources developing synthetic versions of. The Japanese kitchen developed it by putting a piece of dried seaweed in a pot of cold water the night before and going to sleep. And then there was the silence of the seventh trick, which is the silence of fermentation itself. The silence of the nukazuke pickling crock working overnight while the house sleeps. The rice bran bed teeming with microbial activity that the sleeping household cannot hear, but that is, in terms of its consequence for the health of those who eat its products, as productive as any conscious effort the waking hours contain. The vegetables buried in the nukadoko, the cucumber, the carrot, the turnip, the eggplant, undergo a lactic acid fermentation that is distinct from the fermentation of miso or soy sauce in its speed, its bacterial profile, and its nutritional effect. In the 24 to 48-hour ferment of a cucumber in nukadoko produces a food that is meaningfully different from a raw cucumber in its microbial content, its vitamin B12 presence, and its lactic acid concentration. The trick of the nukadoko is the turning. The crock must be turned with the hands every day, worked from the bottom up, the anaerobic lower layers brought to the surface, and the aerobic surface layers pushed down, a daily maintenance that takes 3 minutes and that prevents the development of undesirable organisms while ensuring the proliferation of the lactobacillus species that are the living purpose of the whole enterprise. The daily turning is the practice. The practice is the medicine. You cannot separate them. The eighth trick is the specific temperature at which miso is added to soup, a detail that the traditional recipe transmits as never boil the miso, and that biochemistry transmits as the enzymes and probiotic cultures of fermented miso are denatured at temperatures above 70 degrees Celsius, and boiling miso destroys the precise biological components that make it valuable as a fermented food rather than simply as a flavoring agent. The trick is to turn off the heat or reduce it to the absolute minimum before the miso dissolves into the dashi, and to stir it in slowly through a fine strainer so that it distributes completely without encountering the high heat that would unmake it. The grandmother's instruction was, never boil the miso. The reason was, because your grandmother's grandmother said so. The mechanism was enzyme preservation. The outcome was a bowl of soup that did what miso soup is supposed to do, rather than a bowl of soup that tasted like miso, but had been reduced to miso's ghost. The ninth is the trick of the small dish. The okazu system of the traditional Japanese meal, multiple small dishes of different things rather than one large dish of one thing, a structure that distributes the meal across a wider variety of ingredients and therefore a wider variety of fiber types, fermentation products, phytonutrients, and microbial exposures than any single dish meal of equivalent caloric content can provide. The gut microbiome responds to dietary variety with the same logic that any ecosystem responds to habitat diversity. More kinds of food support, more kinds of organisms, and more kinds of organisms produce a more resilient, more functionally complex ecosystem. The trick is that the small dish system is not a trick at all. It is an architecture of eating that emerged from a culture that had, through centuries of observation and adjustment, arrived at the meal structure that best served the bodies eating it. The modern nutritional epidemiology of the Japanese diet, the studies that attempt to isolate what specifically produces the longevity and metabolic health outcomes associated with traditional Japanese eating, repeatedly converge on dietary diversity as the primary variable. The small dish system is how dietary diversity is operationalized at the table. It is the mechanism by which the grandmother ensured that the family ate 15 different things at every meal without anyone counting to 15 or knowing that counting mattered. The 10th trick is the specific use of katsuobushi, for dried bonito flakes, as a topping and flavoring agent. And the mechanism is the histidine content of katsuobushi, which is among the highest of any food in the traditional Japanese pantry. Histidine is an amino acid that is the direct precursor to histamine in the human body, but more relevantly here, it is also the precursor to a neuropeptide called homocarnosine, which crosses the blood-brain barrier and has been shown to reduce the activity of the hypothalamic appetite circuits that drive overconsumption, specifically the circuits that respond to palatability rather than caloric need. The circuits responsible for eating past the point of hunger because the food is still there and still tastes good. A food high in histidine, eaten regularly as part of a meal structure, contributes to the regulation of appetite from the neurological level down, making the body a more reliable signal sender about when enough is enough. The katsuobushi trembling on the surface of the tofu, lifted and dropped by the rising heat, was not an aesthetic choice, though it was also an aesthetic choice because the Japanese kitchen rarely separated the beautiful from the functional and saw no reason to. The 11th trick is the one that contradicts the most confidently held belief of the modern dietary advice ecosystem, the belief that fat in the diet is the primary driver of fat in the body. The traditional Japanese kitchen used sesame oil, specifically toasted sesame oil, as a finishing oil added after cooking rather than a cooking medium used at high heat, and the sesame lignans, specifically sesamin and sesamolin. That this cold finishing application preserves have been shown to upregulate the enzymes of fatty acid oxidation in the liver, the enzymes that determine the rate at which stored fat is mobilized and burned rather than accumulated. Adding toasted sesame oil after the heat is off is not a flavor decision that happens to have a metabolic consequence. It is, in the logic of the body, a fat-burning instruction delivered in the language of flavor. In our world of plastic and speed, we have replaced this with cooking sprays and refined vegetable oils chosen for their neutrality of flavor, which is to say, chosen for their absence of the very compounds that made traditional cooking fats metabolically active rather than metabolically inert. Neutrality of flavor is neutrality of function. The grandmother's sesame oil was not neutral. It was emphatic. The 12th trick is the practice of hara hachibu, eating to 80% of satiety, which has been documented and discussed extensively enough in the context of Okinawan longevity that it risks losing the specificity of what it actually means at the physiological level. The satiety signal that registers in the hypothalamus as enough lags behind the actual arrival of food in the stomach by approximately 20 minutes, the time required for the stretch receptors of the stomach wall and the hormonal signals produced by the gut endocrine cells to travel through the vagus nerve and the bloodstream to the brain and register as satisfaction. Eating to 80% of what will eventually feel like full requires stopping before the body has told you to stop, which requires either a cultural norm that overrides the instinct to continue or a meal pace slow enough that the 20-minute lag is bridged by the duration of the meal itself. The Japanese meal pace, with its small dishes, its multiple courses of small things, its chopsticks rather than forks and spoons, its cultural emphasis on attention to what is being eaten as a form of respect for the one who made it, naturally produces a meal duration that bridges the satiety lag. The trick is not the stopping. The trick is the structure that makes stopping natural. The 13th is the cold noodle trick of soba, specifically the sobayu practice of drinking the water in which soba noodles were boiled. It is a practice that the soba restaurant formalizes by bringing a small ceramic pitcher of the gray-green cooking water to the table with the final course. The water contains a concentration of rutin, the flavonoid that buckwheat carries in quantities that few other foods match, and rutin has been identified as an inhibitor of the enzyme aldose reductase, which is involved in the polyol pathway of glucose metabolism that becomes problematic in states of chronic elevated blood sugar, contributing to the microvascular damage associated with metabolic disease. Rutin also strengthens the capillary walls of the peripheral circulation, improving blood flow to the extremities that a diet high in refined carbohydrates tends to compromise over time. The sobayu is not the best tasting thing the meal produces. It is the wisest. And the 14th trick is the specific combination of tofu and wakame seaweed in the miso soup that Japanese culinary tradition has maintained for centuries, without knowing why the combination was correct, only knowing that it was. The isoflavones of the tofu and the fucoxanthin of the wakame interact in the gut environment in ways that researchers are still characterizing. But the initial findings suggest that the combination produces a greater effect on adiponectin production, the hormone that regulates fatty acid oxidation and insulin sensitivity, than either compound produces in isolation. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The traditional combination was arrived at not through analysis, but through the accumulated experience of generations of bodies that felt better when they ate them together. And that intelligence, distributed across centuries and expressed as culinary tradition, deserves a respect that the language of biochemistry is only beginning to learn to extend to it. The 15th through 17th tricks move through the garden of the Satoyama, the borderland pantry that supplied the farmhouse kitchen with its deepest medicines. The sansai, the wild mountain vegetables gathered in spring, are collectively among the most nutritionally dense foods the Japanese tradition uses. And the trick of their preparation is the specific blanching and soaking that removes their bitterness, because their bitterness is the concentration of the same phenolic compounds that, in moderated amounts after the blanching has reduced them to tolerable levels, stimulate bile acid production. ANH and bile acids are the digestive compounds most directly involved in fat emulsification and absorption regulation in the small intestine. The bitter food made edible remains medicinally active. The blanching is the calibration, not the elimination. The chrysanthemum green, shungjiku, eaten as a side vegetable or in the hot pot, carries within it a specific combination of chlorogenic acids and luteolin that has been shown to inhibit the differentiation of preadipocytes into mature fat cells, meaning it interferes with the process by which the body creates new fat storage capacity in response to caloric excess. This is not a weight loss supplement. It is a vegetable that the Japanese kitchen put in the nabe pot because it was available, and because it tasted good in broth, and because generations of bodies had registered that it made them feel well, and those three reasons were sufficient and remain sufficient with or without the mechanism. And the myoga, the Japanese ginger bud, eaten raw as a garnish on cold tofu or semen noodles, contains a compound called myogan that has demonstrated antimicrobial activity against several of the pathogenic bacterial species most commonly associated with the dysbiosis, the microbial imbalance that underlies metabolic disease. The grandmother placed the myoga on the cold tofu in August, not because she knew about pathogenic gut bacteria. She placed it there because the myoga was in the garden and the cold tofu needed something and the combination was correct and had always been correct and would always be correct. The 18th trick is the one performed with natto, the fermented soybeans that divide opinion with a reliability that makes them useful, as a litmus test of cultural openness. And the trick is not the eating of them, which everyone knows is the thing, but the specific preparation before eating, the stirring. Natto is stirred vigorously before eating, traditionally 100 times, and this stirring is not a cultural performance or a superstition, but a chemical process, because the vigorous stirring of natto dramatically increases the production of nattokinase, the enzyme produced by Bacillus subtilis natto that is among the most potent natural thrombolytics known to nutritional science, an enzyme that breaks down fibrin clots in the circulatory system and that contributes to the cardiovascular health outcomes associated with regular natto consumption. The stirring produces the enzyme. The enzyme does the work. The 100 stirs are the prescription. The 19th is the trick of using the whole fish, specifically the practice of eating the small dried fish, niboshi and chiramenjiko, whole with their bones. A practice that delivers calcium in a bioavailable form that is more efficiently absorbed than dairy calcium for several specific physiological reasons, including the presence of vitamin D in the fish oil and the collagen peptides in the skin, and connective tissue that improve the uptake of calcium into bone matrix. But the gut microbiome connection is the less obvious one. The collagen peptides of the whole fish, when fermented by the collagen metabolizing bacteria of a diverse gut microbiome, produce hydroxyproline metabolites that signal the intestinal stem cells to regenerate the gut lining at an accelerated rate, maintaining the barrier function that prevents the translocation of bacterial endotoxins from the gut lumen into the systemic circulation. The process called leaky gut in popular language and intestinal permeability in the clinical literature, the process that is the underlying mechanism of the systemic low-grade inflammation associated with metabolic disease and fat storage dysregulation. Eat the whole fish. The bones and the skin and the connective tissue are the medicine. The flesh is the vehicle. The 20th trick is the one that requires the most patience and is rewarded with the most comprehensive return. The long fermentation of homemade pickles, tsukemono, specifically the 3-day to 3-week range of fermentation that produces the lactobacillus diversity that shorter ferments do not have time to develop. The quick pickled cucumber finished with rice vinegar and salt is not the same thing as the 3-day nukadoko cucumber or the 2-week shiozuke turnip. Not in microbial content, not in organic acid diversity, not in the range of probiotic species delivered to the gut ecosystem. The trick is to begin the pickle 3 days before you need it, which requires planning of a kind that the modern kitchen, organized around the immediate and the on-demand, has largely abandoned in favor of the ready-made, the instant, the product that delivers the label promise of fermentation without the time that fermentation actually requires. A jar of commercially produced kimchi or sauerkraut labeled with the word probiotic contains what it had at the time of packaging and has been losing since. Because the living organisms that make fermented food functional are dying continuously in the refrigerator at a rate that makes the product meaningfully different at the back of the shelf from what it was at the front. The homemade pickle made 3 days ago and eaten today is alive. The purchased fermented product opened 6 weeks after manufacture is a record of what was once alive, which is a different thing. The 21st trick is the use of shiitake mushroom soaking water as a cooking liquid rather than a rinsing waste. The dark brown water that results from reconstituting dried shiitake mushrooms containing a concentration of the beta-glucan compounds that stimulate the innate immune system and the lentinan compounds that the shiitake mushroom produces as its own defense against pathogens, and that function in the human gut as powerful immunomodulators, shifting the balance of the gut immune system away from the inflammatory Th2 response that underlies allergic and metabolic disease and toward the regulatory Th1 response that underlies immune tolerance and metabolic flexibility. The soaking water goes into the dashi. The dashi goes into the miso soup, or the simmered vegetable, or the nabe pot. The compounds go into the body, nothing is wasted. The entire chain of the Motenai philosophy is also, in this case, the entire chain of the pharmacological delivery mechanism. The waste is the medicine. The medicine was never the waste. The 22nd is the trick of the black sesame, goma, specifically the way the suribachi mortar is used to grind it until the oil releases. The cell walls of the sesame seed having been breached by the grinding to release the sesamin and sesamolin and gamma tocopherol that remain locked inside the intact seed if it is eaten whole, largely passing through the digestive system without being absorbed. The grinding is the bioavailability trick. The suribachi is the delivery device. The grandmother who ground the sesame in the ridged mortar every morning was performing a pharmaceutical preparation with a kitchen tool, and the distinction between the two categories had not yet been invented in her kitchen. The 23rd is the ginger timing trick, which is the understanding that ginger applied at different points in the cooking process delivers different compounds to the body because gingerol and the primary bioactive compound of fresh ginger and the one responsible for its vasodilatory and anti-inflammatory effects converts to shogaol under heat, and shogaol has a distinct and in some ways more potent anti-inflammatory profile than gingerol, acting through different molecular pathways, inhibiting different cytokines, and persisting in the body for a longer period after consumption. Fresh ginger added at the end of cooking delivers gingerol. Ginger added at the beginning and cooked through delivers shogaol. Adding ginger twice, at the beginning and at the end, delivers both, which is what the grandmother's simmered fish dish did with the 2 pieces of ginger, the one that went in with the sake at the start and the one that went in with the miso at the end, not because she had analyzed the conversion chemistry of gingerol to shogaol, but because she had noticed, over decades of making this dish, that the 2 pieces did something that 1 piece alone did not. The 24th trick is perhaps the quietest of all 25. The habit of beginning every meal with a bowl of soup, and specifically the habit of drinking the soup rather than eating it with a spoon, of lifting the bowl with both hands and drinking from it directly. The warmth of the bowl against the palms being part of the physiological preparation of the digestive system for what is to follow. The warmth of the liquid on the stomach triggers the gastrocolic reflex, which stimulates peristaltic movement through the entire digestive tract, preparing the gut for the efficient processing of the meal to follow. The fermented content of the miso soup stimulates enzyme secretion. The glutamates stimulate salivary flow. The warmth of the bowl against the palms activates the parasympathetic nervous system, shifting the body from the sympathetic fight-or-flight state that the modern meal is often consumed in, at a desk, in a car, while looking at a phone, into the parasympathetic rest and digest state in which the full machinery of digestion operates at its designed efficiency. Hold the bowl with both hands. Feel the warmth. Be, for the duration of the soup, nowhere else. The 25th trick is not a trick with a mechanism and a compound and a metabolic pathway. It is the trick that contains all the others, and without which all the others are diminished. The trick of eating at a table, at a set time, with the same people, the same way, every day. The gut microbiome is regulated by the circadian rhythm, the biological clock that governs every cellular process in the body, and feeding at irregular times disrupts the circadian regulation of the gut microbiome in ways that independently drive metabolic dysfunction, independent of what is eaten, independent of how much, independent of every other variable that the nutritional sciences have identified. The regular meal, eaten at the regular time in the regular way, maintains the circadian entrainment of the gut ecology that allows every other trick on this list to operate at full function. The grandmother's meal was at 7 and 12 and 6. Not approximately. not when convenient. At 7 and 12 and 6, the body knew when food was coming and prepared for it. The gut microbiome knew when food was coming and activated accordingly. The digestive enzymes were ready. The bile acids were pooled. The stomach was primed. The 24 tricks that preceded this one were received by a system that had been expecting them, that had organized itself around their arrival, that had been, in the deepest biological sense, waiting. In our world of plastic and speed, we have confused the freedom to eat anything at any time with the freedom to be well. They are not the same freedom. The body does not experience the absence of structure as liberty. It experiences it as the absence of the signal it needs to organize itself, the signal that says, now. Now is when we eat. Now is when we digest. Now is when we do the work of turning what the earth offered into what you need to continue. Press your palm against the miso crock in the morning. Feel what is alive inside it. Tend what tends you back.